the international evidence-based guidelines for the assessment and management of polycystic ovarian syndrome. Now, this is a guideline which has been put forward by a couple of organizations, including the Center for Research of PCOS, Monash University, ASRM, as well as ESHRE. Now, this working group was established with an objective to develop and translate rigorous, comprehensive evidence-based diagnosis, assessment, and treatment guidelines to improve the lifestyle of women with PCOS worldwide. Now, before I go into the guidelines, it is important to understand how these have been interpreted and what they are recommended. So every aspect has been recommended, or the guideline has been into three categories. One is called evidence-based recommendation, or EBR. This means that there is evidence sufficient enough to form a recommendation. There is sufficient evidence on the basis of which this particular recommendation can be made. Second is the clinical consensus recommendation, where there is no substantial evidence, but a clinical consensus has been recommended by this particular guideline group. And third is only a clinical practice point, where they have not looked at evidence, but it has been made by the group where an important issue arose from these two earlier discussions. So remember these three: evidence-based recommendation, where there is strong evidence to do a recommendation; clinical consensus recommendation, where in the absence of evidence, but a clinical consensus can be recommended; and thirdly is a simple clinical practice point. Having said this, let us start with the basics of polycystic ovarian syndrome. Now, it was initially described by Sten and Leventhal way back in 1935, and hence was earlier also known as Sten-Leventhal syndrome. These women are at a higher risk of infertility, dysfunctional bleeding, obesity, type 2 diabetes mellitus, endometrial carcinoma, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension. The three cardinal features of this condition are androgen excess, polycystic appearance of the ovaries, and oligo or anovulation. And a patient could have an overlap of 2 or 3 out of all the three conditions, leading to numerous phenotypes of this particular. The clinical presentations of this particular syndrome, ranging from hirsutism, oligoovulation, obesity, etc., vary from woman to woman depending on what age she falls in. For example, hirsutism and acne are important or manifest during adolescence and the reproductive year. Oligoanovulation is from mid-adolescence into the reproductive years. Obesity is an issue throughout, right from childhood to the postmenopausal period. Psychological disorders from adolescence right till the end. Infertility obviously is only during the reproductive years. Diabetes from mid-adolescence right till the end, and cardiovascular disorders from mid-reproductive age right till the end. So each manifestation is important and is manifested during different periods of a woman's life. Now, let us see how this has evolved. We first started with the National Institute of Health Guidelines in 1990. The first real consensus meeting was in Rotterdam, 2003, where ESHRE and ASRM came out with the first Rotterdam consensus. Then there was the Androgen Excess and PCOS Society, which modified this in 2006. We then had another meeting of ASRM and ESHRE in Thessaloniki, where the focus was also on treatment. There was then the ESHRE ASRM third consensus meeting, followed by the NIH 2012 meeting on the phenotypes, and then this 2018 guideline. So there has been a lot of changes since the 1990s till today on the diagnosis, investigations, and treatment of this particular disorder. But let us see what are the strengths and limitations of each of the diagnostic criteria. As I had mentioned earlier, the three important ones are androgen excess, oligoovulation and ovulation, and and uh, and uh, a polycystic morphology. So let us look at the androgen excess. Now, androgen excess has been included as a component in all the major classifications and is a major clinical concern. However, the measurement can be performed only in blood. There are numerous challenges because the concentration differ during the time of the day, differ with age. Normative data is not yet defined. Assays are not standardized, and it also varies in different ethnic groups. So even though this forms a major component, there are significant limitations in having biochemical evidence of this particular manifestation. Again, ovulatory disturbances have also been included in all the major classifications. And from a patient perspective, in the reproductive age, infertility is their major complaint. The limitations are again ovulation, normal physiology is incompletely understood, and it is very difficult to measure objectively because you cannot measure every cycle of every patient. Third is on the polycystic morphology, which has been historically associated with this syndrome. But the measurement of this is technique dependent. What machine, what route, what day of the period. It is difficult to obtain standardized measurements. Imaging is possibly inappropriate in certain conditions, especially in young, unmarried adolescent girls. And it is extremely dependent on the person and the equipment by which it has been measured. With this in background, this particular guideline looks at 5 aspects: screening, diagnostic assessment, risk assessment, and life stage management, prevalence and screening and management of emotional well-being, lifestyle management and models of care, medical treatment, and followed by management of infertility. We will look at the diagnosis, screening, and the non-infertility management today. We'll focus on infertility management in the next set. So let us look at the first, the screening, diagnostic assessment, prevalence, and lifestyle models. Now, diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome still remains controversial, with challenges in defining individual components within the diagnostic criteria because there is a huge heterogeneity amongst the different phenotypes. There is also ethnic differences and features change during the life of an individual. Keeping this in mind, let us look at the individual features. The first is irregular cycles and ovulatory disturbance. The question here is that in young adolescent girls, at what time after the onset of menarche would you say that these irregular cycles are significant? The guideline recommendation is that in the first year post-menarche, this should be considered as a part of pubertal transition. Between 1 year to 3 years of menarche, it is abnormal if the cycles are less than 21 days apart or more than 45 days apart. After 3 years, they are abnormal if they are less than 21 or more than 35 days apart, or if the woman has less than 8 cycles in a year. And post-menarche after 1 year, any day of more than 90 days in any one cycle is significant. It is also important that for adolescents who have features of a polycystic ovary but do not meet any of the other diagnostic criteria, only an increased risk should be given. This individual should be assessed at regular intervals before the full reproductive maturity, that is 8 years post-menarche. We should also acknowledge that ovulatory dysfunction can occur with regular menstrual cycles as well, and hence, to have a confirmation, one can measure serum progesterone even if the cycles are regular. What about biochemical hyperandrogenism? Now, the question here is, what is the most effective measure to diagnose biochemical hyperandrogenism? Now, total testosterone alone identifies only 20 to 30% of women having hyperandrogenism, while measures of doing free or unbound testosterone will identify another 50 to 60. Laboratory calculated values are recommended because high quality assays may be providing a more accurate diagnosis, but they come at an additional. So what are the recommendations? The strongest recommendation is that we should use calculated free testosterone, free androgen index, or calculated bioavailable testosterone to assess biochemical hyperandrogenism. Androstenedione and DHEAS should be only considered if the above are not elevated. Direct testosterone assays are not recommended because they demonstrate poor sensitivity, accuracy, and precision. It has also been shown that reliable assessment of biochemical hyperandrogenism is not possible in women who are on hormonal contraception, because in these patients, the contraceptive pills will affect the sex hormone binding globulin. So if you want to assess such women, 3 months of the contraceptive pill withdrawal is recommended before you carry out this hormonal measure. We then move on to clinical hyperandrogenism. Now, what is the most effective clinical feature in hyperandrogenism to diagnose polycystic ovarian syndrome? Thorough detailed physical examination should be taken, looking at all features including acne, alopecia, hirsutism, and in adolescents looking at severe acne or hirsutism. The standard measurement for this is the modified Ferryman-Galway score with a level of more than 4 or 6, which indicates hirsutism depending on the patient's ethnicity. Because the prevalence of hirsutism varies across ethnicity. An ethnic variation in the vellus density is also noted, and this is something which should be kept in. What about the ultrasound features of a polycystic? So when is an ultrasound indicated to confirm or diagnose PCOS? And secondly, what is the most effective ultrasound criteria? If we go back to the 2003 Rotterdam criteria, what this mentioned was 12 or more follicles measuring 2 to 9 millimeters throughout the entire ovary, or an ovarian volume of more than 10 cubic centimeters. Now this was based on a single report on the sensitivity and specificity compared to control. It is also important to note that this term cyst is a misnomer because these are actually arrested follicles and not cysts. That is something which should be kept in mind. What is the recommendation? First, that it should not be used to diagnose PCOS in women who have a gynecological age of less than 8 years, that is within the first 8 years of menarche, because there is a high incidence of multifollicular ovaries this stage of life. Second, the threshold of polycystic ovarian morphology should be revised regularly because ultrasound technology is advancing and we are able to be more and more accurate in identifying small follicles. The transvaginal approach is preferred if the woman is sexually active and the individual. Keeping this in mind, what is recommended is an endovaginal probe with a frequency bandwidth of 8 megahertz, and for this, the number of follicles per ovary should be more than 20 or an ovarian volume of more than 10 millimeters. If we are using the older technology, then the criteria of ovarian volume of more than 10 ml in either ovary would be recommended. It is also a good clinical practice point that if the woman has irregular menstrual cycles and hyperandrogenism, an ovarian ultrasound is not compulsory to diagnose polycystic ovarian syndrome, but it will help in identifying the exact phenotype for that particular patient. And if you're relying on a transabdominal ultrasound, we should look at the more than 10 ml volume because it is difficult to assess the follicular number with this approach. Then comes something which is recent, anti-Mullerian hormone. Is anti-Mullerian hormone effective in diagnosing polycystic ovarian syndrome or polycystic ovarian morphology? Now, given that ultrasound has its own limitation and challenges in diagnosing PCOS, AMH has been proposed as an alternative marker to ovulatory gestation. There have been multiple studies on this, and they tried to see whether any conclusion should be analyzed. It has been known that even though the serum AMH levels in adolescent and adult women with both PCO morphology and PCO syndrome are significantly higher, there is a significant overlap in the values. Keeping this in mind, as of now, it is recommended, and this is a strong recommendation based on evidence, that AMH levels should not yet be used as an alternative to ultrasound to diagnose polycystic ovarian syndrome. But there is emerging evidence that with improved standardization of assays, with more data points and the ability to establish cutoff thresholds, this will eventually help in identifying patients of polycystic ovarian syndrome. We are not yet there to have an absolute cutoff of AMH to diagnose PCOS, but that time may soon come. Let us now look at the areas for risk assessment. One of the major risks which has been associated with polycystic ovarian syndrome are the various cardiovascular diseases. And the question here is, are these women at increased risk of cardiovascular disease? And if so, what is the most effective tool to identify patients? Now, there are meta-analyses which compared the statistical differences in this cardiovascular risk in patients with PCOS versus non-PCOS. And they looked at myocardial infarction, stroke, cardiovascular disease-related deaths, and coronary artery disease. And all this meta-analysis did not show any statistical difference in the PCOS and the non-PCOS. So on screening tools or methods for cardiovascular disease, the group did not identify any evidence in women with PCOS to answer the question which is the most effective. So what this recommends is that women with PCOS should be advised regular monitoring for weight changes, and they should be monitored at a frequency of between 6 to 12 months. They should also be assessed for cardiovascular risk and global cardiovascular disease risk. And if the screening shows a risk, then factors like cigarette smoking, dyslipidemia, hypertension, glucose intolerance, lack of physical activity should be considered to be increased risk factors. Overweight and obese women should have a fasting lipid profile done, and they should be advised appropriate treatment. They should also be subjected to regular blood pressure measurements. And even though there is prevalence of cardiovascular disease in PCOS increased, there is an increased risk for screening, but we still are not able to quantify the risk because high quality studies are still lacking. What about gestational diabetes, impaired glucose tolerance, and type 2 diabetes mellitus? Again, for the same, there are many studies, but less RCTs or meta-analysis. Now, diabetes mellitus 2 risk factors significantly increase the background population risk and prevalence. Now, issue is whether this is further increased in PCOS, independent of BMI, still not warranted. However, the group unanimously agreed that screening was warranted in all adults with PCOS and in adolescents which have a high risk. The optimal tests remain unclear, but the ones which are normally used are fasting glucose, HbA1c, or oral glucose tolerance test. The frequency should be limited to once every 3 years, unless there are additional. So the recommendations are that health professionals should be aware that there is a higher risk for gestational diabetes. It should be assessed at baseline and it should be repeated every 1 to 3 years depending on the presence of additional risk factor. And oral GTT, fasting glucose or HbA1c, all three can be used. And the 75-gram OGTT should be offered to women with PCOS when they are planning pregnancy or infertility. This is something which has recently come to light, and that is the issue of sleep apnea in patients with polycystic ovarian syndrome. The question is, are these women at higher risk? And if so, what is the method to test? Screening and identification of women with symptomatic obstructive sleep apnea is warranted in patients with polycystic ovarian syndrome. That is what this group recommends. What about the risk of endometrial cancer? Are these women at increased risk and how should they be screened? Now, association between PCOS and endometrial cancer is complex with many potential confounders. Women with PCOS do appear to have an increased risk of endometrial cancer consistent with both anovulation and obesity. However, this guideline mentions that routine screening for endometrial cancer in PCOS is not recommended, but vigilance and awareness of this increased risk is important. This is a very carefully worded guideline. So what they have mentioned as a clinical practice recommendation that health professionals and women of PCOS should be made aware of a 2 to 6-fold increased risk of endometrial cancer, which often presents before menopause. They should also have a low threshold for investigation of endometrial cancer. The investigations being transvaginal ultrasound or endometrial biopsy, which is recommended when you find persistent thickening of endometrium or associated risk factors like prolonged amenorrhea, abnormal vaginal bleeding, or excessive weight. Optimal prevention for endometrial hyperplasia and endometrial cancer is not yet known, but a pragmatic approach is to put these patients on a combined oral contraceptive pill or a progesterone therapy if they have cycles prolonged more than 90 days. What about the issue of the psychosocial functions in these women? The guidelines have mentioned that women should be aware of the adverse impact of PCOS on the quality of life. There is also a high prevalence of moderate to severe anxiety and depression symptoms in these women and also in young adolescents. And hence, treatment is warranted. Psychotherapy or pharmacotherapy should be offered to this. Let us now look at certain modifications. The first one being lifestyle. Are lifestyle interventions either combined or on its own effective in treating weight loss, metabolic function, or fertility or the quality of life? There is one high-quality systematic review with its a low bias, which includes randomized trials. It has been shown that lifestyle intervention was better than no treatment in terms of total testosterone, hirsutism, weight circumference, insulin and GTT, and in the percentage of weight loss. But it was not helpful in BMI, free androgen index, and sex hormone binding. What this group recommended, healthy lifestyle behaviors, including eating and regular physical activity, should be recommended to maintain good quality of life. This intervention should be recommended in women with PCOS and excessive weight for reducing this weight and central obesity. An achievable goal is to have around 5 to 10% weight loss from their existing. What about dietary intervention? Are there any specific dietary recommendations and how do they? So a variety of balanced dietary approaches could be recommended. We should follow general healthy eating principles, and to achieve a weight loss, an energy deficient diet of somewhere around 30% or 500 to 750 calories per day should be prescribed to women, and this will help them achieve the desired weight loss. What about exercise interventions? Are these helpful compared to, and they've also compared different forms of exercise. Important guidelines, slightly in detail, that what should be recommended for patients prevention of weight gain are in adults between 18 to 64 years, a minimum of 105 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise or 75 minutes per week of vigorous intensity, including muscle strengthening on 2 non-consecutive days. It has to be a mix of calorie as well as physical activity as well as weight training. In adolescents, 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, and this should be performed in 10-minute bouts. It should also advise the following for modest weight loss or to prevent weight gain, and that is a minimum of 250 minutes per week if they have excessive weight loss. They are grossly obese. What about pharmacological treatment of non-fertility indications? Because as I mentioned, we'll look at fertility measurements in the next. First is the use of combined oral contraceptive pills, either alone or in combination with something else. The question is, do they help these women with PCOS? This is a paper which looked at the impact of metformin, OC pills, and lifestyle modification, a randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial. What this concluded was that both lifestyle modification and OCs significantly reduce the androgens and increase the sex hormone binding. Metformin in combination with lifestyle modification and oral contraceptive pills also reduces central adiposity, but it does not enhance the overall weight. There have been multiple studies which have looked at oral pills versus placebo, oral pills versus metformin, oral pills versus metformin and pills, pills versus lifestyle, pills versus androgens. And these studies have looked at various parameters, the effect on BMI, hirsutism, acne, weight, age, etc. Based on all this publication, the guideline committee recommends that a combined oral contraceptive pill alone should be recommended in adult women with PCOS for management of both hyperandrogenism and or irregular menstrual cycle. It should also be recommended alone in adolescent girls having a clear diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome for both hyperandrogenism and irregular menstrual cycle. Now, specific types of progesterones or estrogens or a COP cannot be currently recommended because there is no evidence comparing each of them. Importantly, a combination of ethinyl estradiol with cyproterone acetate should not be considered as the first line of treatment for PCOS in the general population because this has a higher risk of venous thromboembolism. In combination with pills, metformin should be considered if patients have metabolic features which are not changed by the pills alone. In combination with pill, metformin will also be beneficial in the high metabolic risk groups, that is those who have risk for diabetes or have an impaired glucose tolerance. The anti-androgen should be added with the pills if the patients do not have a significant improvement in their hirsutism after 6 months or more of oral contraceptive pills alone, or this should be offered in patients who have androgen-related alopecia along with PCOS. Although relatively safe, COP or the combined oral contraceptive pill risks and benefits in the general population should be studied. Although combined metformin and COPC offers additional benefits, these do not surpass those offered by pills and lifestyle modifications alone. The combined therapy also leads to increased gastrointestinal side effects, which can interfere in the compliance of this particular. The question then is metformin alone. What we were discussing here is the use of pills with metformin. Now, is metformin alone beneficial? It is a relatively low cost, easily available medication. There have been numerous publications addressing the issue of women with PCOS and impaired glucose tolerance. So this guideline reviewed all these publications, metformin with placebo, metformin with lifestyle, metformin versus anti-estrogen, so and so forth, looking at all different outcomes, right from weight BMI to hirsutism to insulin and glucose levels. These are some of the publications which this guideline had reviewed before coming out with this recommendation. The evidence-based recommendation was that metformin, in addition to lifestyle, could be recommended in adult women with PCOS for the treatment of weight, hormonal, and metabolic outcomes. Metformin with lifestyle should be considered if their BMI is above 25. But when metformin is prescribed, the following should be considered. Mainly, the adverse effects of the gastrointestinal. It should be started with a low dose and increased incrementally at 1 or 2 weeks interval. It appears to be safe on long-term use based on other population studies, but ongoing requirements needed to be considered. It has been thought that its use can be associated with low vitamin B12 levels. This use is generally an off-label use, and this should be discussed with the patients. What about the anti-obesity drugs? Now, anti-obesity drugs, in addition to lifestyle, only be considered when the other medications have failed. For anti-obesity medications, the contraindications, the side effects, and the regulatory status, and the effect of this should the patient become pregnant should be considered before we put these patients on the drugs. Anti-androgen pharmacological agents. Are these important in treating features of patients with polycystic ovarian syndrome? So from a pharmacological point of view, what has been recommended is that a 6-month of oral contraceptive pill should be started. And if the 6-month therapy does not succeed, then the anti-androgens. So this guideline, it is mandatory to use concomitant contraception when the patient is on anti-androgens because you need to prevent virilization of a male child when the patient is on particular anti. What about the use of inositol, alone or in combination? It is a nutritional supplement which acts as a secondary messenger and has to play a role in the insulin signaling mechanism. Currently, this guideline recommends that it should be considered an experimental therapy because we still do not have sufficient evidence about its use and its benefits. So with this, I come to an end to the first part of the recommendations by this group on polycystic ovarian syndrome. We have looked at the screening and the diagnostic and the risk assessments. We have used at lifestyle modifications. We have used at medical treatments looking at non-fertility management. In the next session, we will focus on the screening, the diagnosis, and the management of infertility in patients with PCOS.